gentlemen. It is Pack here. In today's video, I've always been curious. What are the greatest all-time teams of all time? Like, every single franchise has histories of great players throughout their career. I want to know who has the best all-time team, but it wasn't that simple. See, NBA 2K has all-time teams already, but they're very incomplete. So a couple of days ago, I made a roster of a complete all-time teams with like Charles Barkley, Reggie Miller, and accurate ratings, and representing even the players from like the 60s, 50s to make sure everyone was included, all of NBA history. And now I'm going to get these teams, these ratings, these players, and decide what are the greatest all-time teams ever. I'll explain to you how I did it in a second. If you like this channel, please give it a sub. Let's get it, man. Okay, this is exactly how I determined it. I gave every single NBA team a score, or NBA franchise a score, from 30 being the absolute worst score you can get, and 1, which is the absolute best score you can get. I did 4 things to determine this. I averaged every single team's ratings out, and then I averaged their top 10 players out, because there's a difference. Yes, there's some players, like your worst 5 players in your all-time team may not ever touch the court if you had them all on one team. So it's weird to count them in, but they do count. And so I basically got your 15 best players, average rating, your 10 best players, average rating, and then I also got every single NBA team and I put them into a fantasy league, and I did it 3 different times. I averaged out the results of every single NBA team, and I got their results in the NBA standings, and then I also got their results in the NBA playoffs and put it into all one giant score. I know it's kind of complicated, but it worked out. So these are the 30 greatest franchise in order according to NBA 2K23. At number 30, it is the Charlotte Hornets, and it isn't even close. They are easily by far the worst in every single category. The worst franchise in NBA history. Glenn Rice is their only 90 overall player ever, and that was their greatest player who only played for them for 3 seasons. Kemba Walker was an 89. Eddie Jones, I don't even remember Eddie Jones. That's because he played 2 seasons. I mean, he was good in those 2 seasons, but like, dude, he had Alonzo Mourning, Larry Johnson, so those are obviously good players. Al Jefferson, LaMelo Ball, who, you know, it's crazy how LaMelo Ball's played like 2 seasons, 3 seasons, and is now considered an all-time Hornets player, and one of your players is 5'3". No offense to the Hornets. They're just not good. They're not. Now let's look at the Grizzlies. Now, there's no surprise here that most of these teams on the bottom are going to be newer teams. The Grizzlies are a pretty new team in the NBA coming out in the 90s. Marc Gasol is your greatest all-time player. John Morant is already considered the 2nd greatest all-time player, and he's played for a couple seasons, but he's pretty good, so it's fair. Pau Gasol, one of the greatest players. Zach Randolph. They only have 3 players in the 90 overall club, and those 3 players are barely in the 90 overall club. Yeah, it's look, they've had a little bit of success in the NBA. They made a conference finals, but for most of their career, they haven't been a good NBA franchise. So they don't have a lot of good players. That's the facts. Speaking of new teams, the newest team in the NBA, the New Orleans Pelicans. Chris Paul was their best player all time. Chris Paul was going off with it was the New Orleans Hornets, and he was averaging like 23 one season and 11 assists a game on only 3 turnovers. Is absurd numbers. Like, yeah, one of the greatest point guards of all time. Anthony Davis, who we know was putting up video game numbers for years on the Pelicans. The issue is that they never really did good with those years, right? Baron Davis had some pretty good years. Zion Williamson's already considered one of their greatest. Jamal Mashburn, David West, Brandon Ingram. Again, there's some pretty high-level players here, but only a couple, and then that's really it. The Raptors. This shouldn't be a surprise. Besides 2 different instances in NBA history, the Raptors were almost always terrible. Almost always. Vince Carter era was obviously the great year, and then the championship Kawhi Leonard era, yeah, for sure. And Pascal Siakam counts as the Kawhi Leonard era, in my opinion. Besides that, they've been pretty mid. They had some good seasons with DeMar and Kyle Lowry, but like the Chris Bosh era, they were not good. The Stoudemire, Bargianni era, Tracy McGrady was never really good to begin with the Raptors. Fred VanVleet, you know, is only like an 84 overall, and that's like one of their better players right now. Historically, they just haven't been good, and they're also a newer team, so that usually happens. At number 26, the Dallas Mavericks. I was surprised they were this low. The Mavericks ended up with a score of 25, okay? They have Dirk, one of the greatest power forwards of all time, right here. Luka Doncic is turning into an MVP candidate. And besides that, I mean, Rolando Blackman, Mark Aguirre, Jim Jackson, players that were decent on mid teams and never really got anywhere. The rest of this team isn't very good and hasn't really done much in their NBA careers. pretty mediocre team all-time wise besides their 2 best players, if we're just keeping it honest. Another one of those examples is the Minnesota Timberwolves at 25, a ranking of 24.5. I'm shocked they're over the Mavericks, by the way. That's crazy how bad the Mavericks have been all time if the Timberwolves are above you. But Kevin Garnett, MVP, of course he's here. Kevin Love, 92 overall. He had a very, very good season with the Timberwolves. Jimmy Butler helped the Timberwolves make the playoffs. Karl-Anthony Towns has been there for a while and has been very good for a long time. And then besides that, nothing really. It's just, so you have a couple players here, but the rest of your roster, I mean, going back to the very back, you have Andrew Wiggins and Ricky Rubio making your roster. It's not going to be a very good all-time team. Another one that kind of surprised me at number 24 is the Magic, because they have 2 instances of making NBA Finals. You would think they'd be better all time, but you have Tracy McGrady, who's averaging 30 for a season, or actually 32 for a season, which is insane. You have Shaq, who was dominating. You had Penny Hardaway, who was dominating. You had Dwight Howard, multiple Defensive Player of the Year, made an NBA Finals. And then that's it. You have the ghost of Grant Hill. Vucevic was always mediocre. I mean, it's decent for a long time. Yeah, if you look at this team historically, you can kind of understand that besides the very best players, everyone else was pretty mid. Another shocker for me, at number 23 is the Miami Heat with a ranking of 22. So LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Alonzo Mourning, Jimmy Butler, Tim Hardaway, and Shaq. After that, it kind of becomes a era of like, well, Chris Bosh wasn't in his prime anymore. Glenn Rice was okay. And then it's a bunch of guys that are just kind of for a long time. Again, they're top heavy. A lot of these teams that are very down here or below here is because they're only top heavy. Now, you do have, maybe the greatest player of all time on your team, so that should help a lot. But everyone else, the Heat, again, historically, the Heat is a new word team. This is what's going to happen rating-wise. At number 22, it's the Wizards. The thing is, this is a very unexciting team, right? They have a ranking of 20.5. They did win an NBA championship, and they made another NBA Finals after that. Elvin Hayes was very good. Gilbert Arenas was shooting it up, let me tell you. Wes Unseld was good for a long time. Walt Bellamy. But these are players, these are not household names besides Gilbert Arenas. That's the thing. And their ratings are 90s, but not high 90s. You had John Wall, Pearl Monroe, Bradley Beal, but again, no crazy big household names to carry this all-time team. At number 21 with a ranking of 19.5 is the Pacers. Now, maybe an underrated all-time team. You have Reggie Miller, who was added onto this team. There was the best player. Mel Daniels was winning multiple ABA championships. Paul George was having good seasons. Jermaine O'Neal was the best player for a while. George McGinnis was good. But again, it kind of comes back to you need like your 98 overall player to really carry you. And like, yeah, you have some low 90 overall players, but not a lot of high 90 overall players. And that's what's going to hold back the Pacers. But they are an underrated team all time for sure. Now we're in the top 20. This would be the first team that makes it into the NBA play-in tournament of all time teams. The Pistons. The Pistons have multiple seasons of winning championships and eras of success. Isaiah Thomas was one of the greatest point guards of all time. Joe Dumars, the 93 overall. Bob Lanier was a demon for a long time. Grant Hill's prime was crazy. Chauncey Billups won a championship with, you have a lot of 90 overalls, and then even like the 89 overalls are like defensive player of the years. Like, it's a stacked team, deserves to be one of the greatest ever. 19 is the Utah Jazz. You have multiple like 97 overalls of the 94, 94. Very top heavy team, but also made multiple NBA finals. I mean, this is a very good team all time. But again, there's better teams for sure. At number 18, Cleveland Cavaliers. This one's pretty hard carried by maybe the greatest player of all time, LeBron James. They won an NBA championship because LeBron kind of went crazy. Kyrie Irving had a really good time with them. Mark Price and Brad Daugherty are making the playoffs pretty consistently back in the 90s and 80s with Larry Nance. So they have 2 eras of being good. And even now with Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland, they're playing pretty well. So they have 3 different eras of being good in the NBA. But is definitely not enough to carry them past the 18th spot all time. At number 17 is the Portland Trailblazers. One of the greatest shooting guards of all time, and Clyde Drexler. Dame is one of our best point guards in the modern era. Bill Walton won an NBA championship. LaMarcus Aldridge was a very consistently good power forward for a long time. Brandon Roy was a bucket before he got hurt. A consistently good team with some top heavy talent. It's going to help you in the long run. And they've been around for a long time. The history carries them as well, for sure. Now at 16, this will be the first team to make it into the official, NBA playoffs of all time, is the Atlanta Hawks. Dominique Wilkins, we know how good he is. Bob Pettit, they had multiple years in the 50s and 60s, I believe, winning championships from my understanding. Mutombo is one of the greatest defensive players of all time. Cliff Hagan was doing stuff with Bob Pettit for years. Lou Hudson, you have Trae Young now doing very well. So years and years and years of conference finals appearances, NBA finals appearances. They're 75 years old. This, of course, they're going to be here all time, right? At number 15 is the Brooklyn Nets. This is the most mid team of all time, apparently. They're at number 15. They're right in the middle. Dr. J had multiple years of greatness in, I guess it was New York Nets at the time. Kevin Durant, we know, is one of the greatest players ever. Jason Kidd had multiple finals appearances. Petrovic was ridiculously good before his passing. Kyrie Irving, you know, we know how skilled he is. Vince Carter was very good when he was still on the Brooklyn Nets. All-time leading scorer, Brooklyn Net. Brooke Lopez was right here. Like, yeah, I mean, you have years and years and years of greatness with years and years and years of all-time players. It's going to carry you. I'm a little disappointed how low this one is. At number 14, the Spurs. Now, this is my team, obviously. They have a ranking of 13 all-time. Tim Duncan is the greatest power forward of all time. David Robinson, one of the greatest centers. George Gervin, one of the greatest scorers ever. Tony Parker, one of the winningest point guards of all time. Kawhi Leonard is arguably one of the greatest players of all time already. Manu Ginobili is the greatest sixth man of all time. Alvin Robinson is the greatest ball stripper of all time. Like, yeah, I mean, you just go deep into the all-time team of the Spurs, who have been around forever. Yeah, you're gonna be one of the greatest teams ever, for sure. I agree that this feels wrong, and I'm gonna call 2K out on this one, but at 13, somehow the Clippers are above the Spurs. I know that's crazy. Let's try to figure it out. So they have Bob McAdoo, who is one of the best centers like ever. You have Chris Paul, one of the greatest point guards ever. You have Kawhi Leonard, who hasn't really done anything with the Clippers yet, but has been good with them. Blake Griffin was one of the greatest dunkers of all time. Elton Brand had good seasons. Will be free. It was a 90 overall. Paul George 89. I can't see how the Clippers are this high, but they performed really well when we did simulations of NBA seasons. They won a lot. So, you know, at the end of the day, 2K thinks they would win. This is a formula of success, this team, for some reason. At number 12, we have the Milwaukee Bucks. This Milwaukee Bucks franchise won 2 NBA championships in 2 completely different generations in the 70s and the 2000s, well, 2020s actually, with, you know, 2 generational talents of Kareem and Giannis. I mean, those 2 players alone are going to carry your team hard. But then you also had Oscar Robertson, triple-double machine. Sidney Moncrief, one of the greatest perimeter defenders ever. Ray Allen, one of the greatest shooters ever. Yeah, I mean, a lot of players on a lot of different eras. I mean, you had the 2000s era, Ray Allen making the conference finals. Like, you had so much talent for like all time. Of course they're here. At number 11, a team you're gonna forget that is great is the Nuggets. You gotta remember that the Nuggets have been good for a long time. They have very few seasons of being bad in general. Now you have Jokic carrying the Nuggets, doing amazing seasons. You had David Thompson being one of the greatest scorers ever with the Nuggets for multiple seasons. You had Carmelo Anthony being good with the Nuggets for multiple seasons, being one of the better players in the NBA. Alex English in the 90s, Fat Lever in the 90s. I mean, I don't know if you've realized, Mutombo in the 90s, 2000s, you're gonna realize that historically, every single generation of the NBA, every single decade, they were good. Every single one. At number 10, it is the Phoenix Suns. Not really a surprise. You shouldn't be surprised about the Suns. Kind of the same thing I said about the Nuggets, I say about the Suns. Almost every single decade, they were good. The Steve Nash MVP seasons, the Charles Barkley MVP seasons, the Connie Hawkins years. You look at, they have 3 different decades of just being absolutely juggernauts. They're going to be all time here at number 10, and multiple MVPs, like, of course. At number 9, the New York Knicks. In the Knicks defense, I know because some of you are like, they only won 2 championships ever. In their defense, they've been around forever. They've had multiple years of having good players. Walt Frazier, Patrick Ewing, Willis Freed, all players that have made NBA finals and even won NBA championships. You have Carmelo Anthony, who was just good for a long time with the Knicks, putting up video game numbers. Richie Gruen, you know, NBA champ DeBusschere. Bernard King was having multiple seasons being one of the best players in the NBA. Allen Houston made an NBA finals. Earl Monroe, for the longest time, was respected in New York. Like, just so many years of so much greatness into one team is going to be good no matter what. At number 8, the Chicago Bulls. Now, this is going to be hard carried by maybe the greatest player of all time, Michael Jordan. You have Scottie Pippen, 97 overall. The thing about the Bulls that maybe some of you think they should be higher, you got to remember that the Bulls only really have one generation of greatness, and that was the 6P. Besides that, what have they really done? Derrick Rose is doing pretty good. Besides that, like, look at all time, it's not that impressive besides the Michael Jordan era. And so one era of greatness will not carry you when all the other teams above you have multiple seasons and years of just being great. It's going to be hard. Great example of that. At number 7 is the Warriors. Now, the Warriors probably should be higher here, but you have Steph Curry, Wilt Chamberlain, 2 of, like, you could argue Curry's maybe the greatest player of his generation. And then Wilt was absolutely the greatest player of his generation. And then Kevin Durant, you know, you just have so much top-heavy talent. And Rick Barry was putting up video game numbers. Nate Thurman was a great center. Then you have Paul Risen. Like, so many different years of so many different good players and teams. Championships from so many different eras that, like, they're going to be here at top 7. Probably should be top 5. Now, I hope you're sitting down for this one. This might be the greatest surprise of all time. At number 6, the Sacramento Kings. You got to understand the Sacramento Kings. They have a ranking of 6.7. Okay. Oscar Robertson, during the 60s, was maybe one of the best players, or maybe the best player in the NBA. Triple-double machine. Jerry Lucas was right there with him, putting up video game numbers as well. Then you have Mitch Richmond, who had multiple seasons in Sacramento, averaging like 25 a game in the 90s. You have Tiny Archibald in the 70s, cooking, averaging 30 a game. You have Chris Webber, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, making conference finals appearances. You have Jack Twyman in the 50s, going crazy. DeMarcus Cousins was one of the best centers. I know he didn't make the playoffs, but he was one of the best centers in the NBA during the 2010s. Like, again, you have multiple great generational talents on almost every single era of basketball besides this era, right? It's gonna do you well. The Kings have won an NBA championship. They've been good for a long time. It's just that recently they've been terrible, but it's only recently. Now, none of these teams are going to be a surprise to you. At number 4, the 76ers, ranking of 4.7. You know, again, another team that has multiple generations of being good. Moses Malone and Julius Erving's championship season. You have Allen Iverson carrying the Sixers to a finals. You have Will Chamberlain, multiple great seasons with the Sixers. You have Joel Embiid, you know, being one of the best centers in the NBA right now. Again, that's 3 different generations. It's just of greatness. And of course, they're going to be here. They're one of the oldest teams, such history of they're going to be here no matter what. At number 3, the Houston Rockets. Now, just because they only have one generation of championships, which was 2 years, the back-to-back Clutch City, you also have the Moses Malone years, where he was in the 70s and 80s, probably for that era the best player in the NBA. You have James Harden making multiple conference finals appearances. You have Tracy McGrady being amazing for years. Calvin Murphy was one of the best point guards. Yao Ming was different. Chris Paul had very good years. You know, just so many great players all time on this team that carry the Rockets really hard. Now, the top 2 are going to be no surprise, but the order might shock you. At number 2, the Lakers. The Lakers are the 2nd greatest team of all time according to 2K with a 2.3 ranking. Magic Johnson's the greatest point guard ever. Kobe's one of the greatest shooting guards. Shaq's one of the greatest centers. Jerry West is one of the greatest point guards. Kareem's one of the greatest centers, maybe the greatest center. Elgin Baylor, one of the greatest small forwards. LeBron James is the greatest small forward of all time. I mean, I'll talk about stacked, and it keeps going, by the way. James Worthy, Mike and Anthony Davis, Wilt Chamberlain. It's insane how it just keeps going. Pau Gasol, it's insanity. One of the most stacked teams ever. And at number 1, the Celtics. Interesting for me. Larry Bird, obviously. Bill Russell. Havlicek. This team definitely dominated in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Basically, the 60s, 70s, and 80s were all the Celtics. They were like really the team that dominated those entire generation. The 90s and 2000s is when it slowed down, but then in 2010 they won a championship again, and then you see them in the finals again just last season. This is a generational, every single year they at least had someone like Paul Pierce. They always had JoJo White. They had Robert Parrish. They had Kevin Garnett. They had Bill Sharman. And they have Jason Tatum now, right? Like, they're just, every single generation had someone, and I think they're always bound to be good no matter what. The greatest franchise in basketball history, according to 2K. But let me know your opinions in the comments below. Obviously, this is controversial. What do you think? I think the Spurs being below the Clippers is like insanity, right? But let me know what you think. If you like this channel, please give it a sub. I'll see you guys next time.